thereafter, two things in a sense were at work. When something that potentially could be called a genocide seemed to be happening. Because it was enshrined in international law, many governments didn't want to use the word because then they would be obligated to do something about it. So you have, for instance, in the months before Rwanda, very explicitly the American State Department and the consulate there not using, quote, the G word, because that would put this into the category of a violation of international law, and then we would be compelled to act, while otherwise we could turn our back on a ages-old tribal conflict in Rwanda that was nobody else's business. So there was in the face of potential genocide, many governments chose to define them as other than genocide, simply so that they wouldn't have to lift a finger. And you had that sort of the people who were responsible for enforcing the law had an interest in not enforcing the law because it's cheaper to do nothing than something. And secondly, you then had quarrels over what kind of group is it? Is it really a group that falls under the categories? And claims of others that, what happened to us should be classified as a genocide, and a kind of competitive victimization. And that too, I may say, sort of muddied the waters, made it more difficult to have clarity. So enforcing the Genocide Convention basically just didn't happen. And it wasn't, I think, until Clinton actually decided we would intervene in Kosovo in the face of what looked like going to be a massive ethnic cleansing of 80 or 90% of the population there. To avoid that catastrophe, he basically intervened, and we had the air war against Serbia, NATO air war against Serbia, that did indeed eventually gain autonomy and independence for Kosovo. So the claim was, well, it seemed to have prevented a genocide. Well, some people who didn't like the Americans getting involved in that kind of international dukism said, well, there was no genocide. It didn't happen. So why did we go and kill Serbians? Well, of course, the problem with genocide is you don't know it's happened until it's already happened, and then it's too late to stop it. It is always going to be an anticipatory game in which you don't know the future. And politicians will be making decisions about something that might become a genocide, that has the potential to become a genocide, and acting in time. And almost nobody wants to act until they're sure, and by the time you're sure, it is too late. One thing we've seen from Rwanda and Darfur, if you carry out a genocide fast enough, no one has time to intervene, or if you carry out slow enough, drip, 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 there's no trigger point at which people will say, now they have gone too far. If you kill people in Darfur slowly enough, incrementally enough, there's no Srebrenica, then there is no trigger at which people will invoke the Genocide Convention, even if cumulatively the result is the same. So it is, there's immense political problems with enforcing it as international law, and aside basically from the brief intervention in Kosovo, it simply hasn't been.
I think the other, I'll let Mariana, por favor.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this excellent conference. You spoke about social psychology, and you spoke about definitions. I wanted to ask you, relating these two concepts, have you seen a social, psychological effect of naming something as a genocide? For example, we saw a week ago the Cambodian special courts naming the killings of Vietnamese Cham and Muslims as a genocide, even if that came many years later. We've seen some attempts in municipal courts to define killings of groups that are not national, ethnic, racial, or religious as genocide, such as in some municipal courts in Argentina, for example. I am a lawyer, so I always argue saying it's not necessary. But I do understand that there might be a very profound social impact or psychological impact of naming something a genocide and not something else. And I wanted to ask you if you have seen this in the field and in your work.
I think you're right that the emotive power of stamping something a genocide is the way in which people try to motivate others to intervene and to stop whatever is happening. Usually it's something horrible happening, but it may not meet the legal definition of genocide, but in the desperation to get people to help, they want to invoke that term. Or they want to invoke that term just simply so that their group can in a sense use that, I don't know what the right word is, to have standing in terms of their own sense of that their suffering has been recognized. A classic example would be the term the gay Holocaust by the Nazis. Well, there was no gay Holocaust. The Nazis set out to certainly make life miserable for male gay men in Germany. We're not much concerned with lesbians. And we're perfectly clear that homosexuality in other parts of Europe were not their concern at all, because the lower the birth rate of the other nations, the better. The more homosexuals, good. This was not a war on homosexuality. It was a war on a certain group of people who they felt were withholding their reproductive capacities from the battle of populations in Germany. And so they were trying to coerce them into altering their behavior. That's not a genocide. But nonetheless, because the Nazis had carried out genocides against others, it was feeling, our suffering isn't recognized unless we can get that term applied to our suffering too. The suffering was very real. I don't want to belittle the suffering, but it wasn't a genocide. So there is the attempt to use the term to get recognition for past sufferings and to mobilize support for current sufferings, which if you don't have the ultimate term, people don't react quite the same way. Legally, it is much easier to prosecute crimes against humanity than it is against genocide. And indeed, we now know from this book by Philip Sands that the argument, in the sense, at the end of World War II, was it was much more important to put emphasis on a human rights, because that was much easier to get into court and to actually enforce. And I think he was right in that regard. But it also missed the essence of what the Nazis were about. They weren't just violating human rights, they were violating the rights of certain groups to exist. And that was essential to understand. So that may have been a good legal argument, it ignored a historical reality. So now we have the two, they are a bit in competition, and one is more of an historical concept and one is a better legal concept. I think we do better if we very quickly move to the human rights violations and act on it. If we want to stop things, I think that's the quickest thing one can bring to bear. We don't have this problem that if you wait to see if it's a genocide, you've waited too long, and you can move immediately. So I guess that I would say we need to keep both, but we ought to be acting on the human rights legislation as quickly as possible, because that's more doable.
¿Alguien más?
I have a question. When I spoke earlier, I was talking about UNESCO's role in teaching about Holocaust and trying to prevent genocide from happening. But what you were describing leaves me to think that it's very hard, because you may have the education in your programs, in your even elementary curriculum, and all the way through the schooling system. But if the conditions happen, again, in a certain situation with a certain group, human beings are going to divide into those categories, and education will not have been able to prevent something like this. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the discouraging thing is that, in fact, democracy, which was certainly expanding, and certainly after 1989 seemed to be carrying the day, is now under assault and in retreat. And that we are engaged in a kind of pullback, and the rise of a new authoritarianism, which preserves the window dressing of democratic practice while hollowing out the reality in terms of accountability, what in a sense the new dictators have discovered is you don't have to have a totalitarian dictatorship. You can preserve your power and keep yourself in power with much less than that. And you can corrupt the free press by saturating so much false news out there that no one can keep it straight. You can, in my country, gerrymander and suppress voting to the point that many people can get elected no matter what. There's no accountability. They're guaranteed of getting elected. There's no way to hold your elected officials accountable in many districts in the United States now. The same person can get elected no matter how terrible they are, how badly they behave. And fortunately, that's not a majority yet, as we found out, a couple of weeks ago. But nonetheless, that is what's happening in other countries that are reaching that point. So that you have elections in Russia. Good luck with an alternation of power. You have elections still in Turkey. Well, do you think Erdogan's going to lose an election? I don't believe so. I mean, we've gotten to the point we can hold elections that are rigged, and you preserve the appearance of democratic fig leaf, and it's hiding the nakedness of authoritarianism.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Tienes otra pregunta? Sí, claro, te paso el micrófono. Creo que no te había contestado la de negación, si te refieres. ¿Tienes otra pregunta?
Sí, de hecho. I think one of the problems in the world are hate speeches, especially in social media. So what would you say to the new generations to stop paralyze these speeches and remember to all of them that we are humans before nationalities or races or just like that?
Certainly hate speech is one of the more difficult things we have to deal with, because at the same time as you want to deal with that, you also want to preserve the value of free speech. So you're in that situation where you have a conflict in which you have a very valuable good, free speech, threatened by the misuse of free speech to propagate hate speech. And so there is, again, no simple answer. I think what does have to be made clear is certainly, we already know this, say, from newspapers, they don't have to publish hateful ads. They exercise editorial discretion. They don't have to publish hateful letters to the editor. That they can exercise responsibility and not give platform. That person has a right to go out on the sidewalk and shout his hate, but he doesn't have a right to appear in print and have it disseminated widely, unless he buys his own newspaper. The problem now, of course, is we have access to social media in which anybody can get anything out there, which we didn't have before. Dissemination was the protection against hate speech becoming too widely disseminated. And now that's broken down. So the real, how can we restore editorial responsibility to the social media platforms, which clearly that has to happen. I mean, the whole problem we know with Facebook and these others is they took this view, oh, we're just providing a speaker's platform in Central Park. Well, they're not. They're providing a worldwide instantaneous access, and that we can't have that kind of power of dissemination without some kinds of gatekeepers. And the technology of that and who's the gatekeeper then becomes the new question. Because if the gatekeeper is the wrong person, then we're back to the same problem, how do you preserve free speech? So this is the area in which we were going to be wrestling with this devil for the next few years. I mean, if there was an easy answer, we would be doing it. But we know what we have to solve, we just don't know how to solve it yet.
I think students have another class, right? At 5:30. So I would like to thank you for your extraordinary talk. It's an honor to have you both in Mexico and at Anahuac University. And I would also like to extend my gratitude to Wolpert, who came from UNESCO Mexico office. She is the Director of Education in the UNESCO office in Mexico, and also to Krista and Ellen, who came all the way from DC, and to the support that the Holocaust, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, both the museum and UNESCO have given to this project that allowed us to have Professor Browning today with us. So, and thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you. We hope you come back.
Thank you.